"My dream is to be a doctor," said the cleaning lady. And the millionaire laughed, but 3 years later. There came a day when Brianna opened her mouth and said what she had been holding inside for years, and what she heard back was a laugh. Not that careless chuckle of someone who doesn't understand. It was a full laugh looking down on her from someone who genuinely found it funny. The kind that hurts not because it's loud, but because it's so full of certainty. And Brianna stood there, yellow gloves in her hands, the mop resting against her leg, staring at that woman doubled over, laughing without being able to stop, not quite understanding what was happening. Or maybe understanding all too well. She had heard a lot of things throughout her life. She had heard that there was no way, that people like her didn't make it, that dreaming was nice, but paying the bills was necessary. She had heard it in her mother's tired voice from her boyfriend's mouth, in the heavy silence of the neighbor who shook his head when she told him she studied late into the night. But she had never heard anyone laugh like that, with so much certainty that it was impossible. That laugh stayed in Brianna's head for a long time. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night and still hear its echo in the darkness of her room. But what life was about to show is that some laughs cost the person laughing dearly. The story begins about 2 years before that day. Brianna was 27 years old and worked for Pristine Home Solutions, a cleaning company that serviced homes in an upscale neighborhood in Atlanta. She woke up every day at 5 in the morning, had some watery coffee, caught 2 buses, and arrived at work with her uniform impeccable, because it was one of the few things she could control. The blue apron, always neatly pressed. The yellow rubber gloves carefully stored in her pocket. The mop, the bucket, the cloths folded in order. Everything in its place, because when the rest of life was hard to organize, at least the work could be done with care. At night, after a shift that would leave anyone breathless, Brianna sat at the small table in the room she shared with her mother and opened her biology book. Then chemistry. Then physics. She had been preparing for the medical school entrance exams for 4 years. She had tried twice and hadn't passed, but she hadn't stopped. Her mother, Martha, was 62 years old and had health that had been crying out for help for a long time. Kidney problems that came and went, a tiredness that rest couldn't fix, appointments at low-cost clinics that always ended with referrals to specialists she couldn't afford. Brianna looked at her mother and thought, this is why. This was why she needed to become a doctor. Not out of vanity, not for the diploma on the wall. It was because she wanted to understand what was happening to the body of the person she loved most in the world, and she wanted to be in a position to do something about it. Justin, the boyfriend she had been living with for 3 years, saw things differently. He wasn't a bad man, no, but he was practical in a way that sometimes hurt. "Brianna, you already have a job," he would say, with that voice of someone who thinks they're being reasonable. "We could take that money you spend on the pre-med prep course and buy something nice, a motorcycle so I can get to work. I don't know." She would take a deep breath and not answer, because she knew that if she opened her mouth, too much would come out. She kept it all inside and went to study. It was on a Tuesday in September that Brianna went to work at a new house. The company had signed a contract with a different client, a woman named Victoria Sterling, who lived in a high-end luxury apartment on the 12th floor of a modern building. The living room was absurd, white from floor to ceiling, with enormous windows that took up the entire wall and let in a brightness that seemed unreal. Light-colored sofa, objects in just the right places, everything very beautiful and very empty at the same time, like those homes that seem more like a movie set than an actual residence. Fernanda, Victoria, was 38, tan with long, well-cared-for hair, and that morning she was wearing a red dress, as if she were heading out to some party, even though it was an ordinary Tuesday. She walked around the apartment talking on the phone, giving instructions about some event, and barely glanced at Simone, Brianna, when she arrived. She just pointed with her hand at the rooms where she wanted her to start. At first, everything went normally. Brianna did what she knew how to do, clean well, quickly, without getting in the way. But at one point, when the two crossed paths in the middle of the living room and the silence stretched a little too long, Victoria asked, in that tone of someone asking just to ask, without expecting much back, "Have you been doing this for a long time?" "About 5 years with this company," Brianna replied. "And do you like it?" Brianna paused for a second. She didn't like lying, but she also didn't want to open the door to the kind of conversation that type of question usually started. "It's honest work," she said. Victoria nodded, as if that were a complete answer. But then she kept looking at Brianna in a different way, with that shallow curiosity of someone with time to kill, and asked, "And what do you want out of life? Do you have some other plan?" Brianna still doesn't know why she answered what she answered in that moment. Maybe it was the exhaustion of a sleepless night. Maybe it was because she had spent the entire early morning studying embryology, and her head was still full of it. Maybe it was simply because someone had asked, and so few people ever asked. "I want to be a doctor," she said. And that's when Victoria laughed. It wasn't a little accidental chuckle. It was a real laugh, wide open. The kind of laugh from someone who had just heard the funniest thing all week. She even bent forward a little, hand on her knee, hair slipping over her shoulder, and it took a good few seconds for her to pull herself together. Brianna didn't move. She stood there, yellow rubber gloves on her hands, holding the squeegee, watching that woman laugh the way people laugh when they think they're alone. When Victoria recovered, she said, still with the leftover smile at the corners of her mouth, "Oh, sorry, it's just... medicine? You know how many years that takes, right? And how much it costs?" "I know," Brianna said. "And you're actually studying?" "I am." Victoria looked at her with that expression that sits somewhere between pity and skepticism, and said, "That's nice the way people say it when they don't believe a word of it." Then she turned and headed toward the kitchen, as if the conversation was already over. Brianna went back to work. She finished the apartment, put away her supplies, took the elevator, left. On the bus ride back, she didn't cry. She stared out the foggy window and thought, "It's okay, it's okay." But inside something had trembled. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, what Brianna didn't know was that there was one more person in the apartment that morning. In one of the back suites, with the door cracked open, was Mrs. Eleanor. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling was 72 years old, Victoria's mother, and she was staying at her daughter's house for a while after a health checkup that had required her to be closer to a medical center. She was a small woman with completely white hair pinned at the nape of her neck with a simple clip, carrying on her back a long history, and she had learned over many decades to recognize the value of things that others easily discard. She had heard everything through the door, the question, the answer, and the laughter. When Brianna left, Mrs. Eleanor slowly came out of the room carefully and went to the kitchen, where Victoria was pouring herself a glass of water with an expression that was still mildly amused. "Did you hear what that young woman said?" Mrs. Eleanor asked. "I heard, Mom. Her dream is really beautiful." "Victoria, what?" "Do you remember that my mother used to take in laundry?" Victoria's smile disappeared. "This subject again, Mom." "It's not a subject. It's a memory. Your grandmother took in laundry, and I studied with the money she made that way. Exactly what did you find so funny?" Victoria stared at her glass of water without answering. Mrs. Eleanor opened her purse, took out an old notebook, carefully jotted something down, tore out the page and left it on the kitchen counter. "I want that young woman's contact information. Ask the company for her phone number." "What for, Mum?" "You don't need to know that right now." And that was how Mrs. Eleanor came into Brianna's life, not in a dramatic way, not with speeches or promises. She called a week later, introduced herself by her full name, said she was Victoria's mother, and asked if Brianna would be up for having coffee on a Saturday afternoon at a bakery cafe near the bus station that she herself had chosen. Brianna accepted without really understanding why, and she went. They sat for almost 2 hours at a small table in the back, with coffee and fresh bagels, and Mrs. Eleanor asked about her studies, about the medical school entrance exams, about Martha, about the books she used. Not with that air of someone doing charity, not with the tone of someone who thinks they're superior, with the genuine air of someone who is truly interested. At the end, Mrs. Eleanor folded her hands on the table and said, "My granddaughter went to medical school. She graduated last year. She studied for 3 years at a private pre-med prep course. And I kept all the material when she left. There are boxes and boxes, books, study guides, exercise workbooks, everything separated by subject, everything with the answers. If you want, I'll give it all to you. Brianna looked at her for a while. Ma'am, you don't know me. I know you better than you imagine. I heard the way you answered my daughter in that apartment. Not with anger, not with tears. With the word I know. And then with the silence of someone who isn't going to explain what doesn't need to be explained. She paused briefly. Someone who reacts like that in the face of humiliation has an inner structure that doesn't bend easily. I had to pause for a moment when I found out about this part, because sometimes it's something small like that that changes everything. A door left ajar. A person who decides to pay attention when they could have turned their back. Brianna accepted the material. There were 5 large boxes that Mrs. Eleanor had delivered to her house by a motorcycle courier on a Wednesday morning. Justin looked at the boxes in the hallway with that expression of disbelief and said she had gone crazy to accept something from a stranger. She's not a stranger, Brianna said. She's a lady who understands what I feel. Justin went to stand in front of the television and said nothing more. But something between them had changed in that moment, and they both knew it, each in their own way. With the new material, Brianna's preparation became different. The study guides were complete, full of exercises, solved step by step, organized by topic and difficulty level. Brianna began to understand where she was going wrong, what she needed to reinforce, how to manage her study time. She kept working every day, kept coming home with heavy feet, kept studying in the wee hours. But now she had a clearer direction, and direction changes everything when a person already has strength. Mrs. Eleanor called every week, sometimes just to ask how she was doing, sometimes to share something small, a different way to review content, a tip her granddaughter had passed along. Brianna realized those calls weren't just about the medical school entrance exams. They were about not letting the flame go out in a moment when the wind was strong. 3 months later, the first big blow came. The company where Brianna worked lost 3 contracts all at once because of a change in the way they charged for the service that the clients didn't accept. And suddenly, Brianna watched the hours shrink, the pay shrink, and the tension at home grow at a rate she couldn't ignore. Justin seized the moment. I told you, Brianna, you spent money on the prep course. You got dependent on materials from some old lady you didn't even know, and now what's left? You need to be realistic for once. She stayed quiet for about 3 days. She didn't sleep well. She kept staring at the books on the table with that heaviness that's different from physical exhaustion. It's the weight of thinking. What if I really am wrong about myself? What if everyone who doubted me was right? It was Martha who broke the silence. One afternoon when the two of them were in the small kitchen and Brianna was standing there holding her mug, staring at the wall, her mother said, in that voice she saved for serious things, Brianna, do you remember the day you were 8 years old and I had to pull you out of ballet because we didn't have the money to keep paying for it? Brianna said she remembered. You cried an entire afternoon, but the next day you got up, went to school, and never asked me to go back. Because even as a little girl you already understood that sitting around complaining doesn't change what needs to be changed. Martha paused. You haven't forgotten that, have you? Brianna set her mug in the sink. She went to study. She started picking up odd jobs on the weekends, cleaning offices and salons after events, anything that paid enough to cover what she had lost. Within a few months, she had reorganized the bills and gotten back into her old rhythm. Justin saw that she wasn't going to give in, and he grew quieter and quieter on the subject. But his silence wasn't one of peace. It was the kind of distance that keeps growing until one day people realize they're in different rooms inside the same apartment. The entrance exams came in October. Brianna walked into the testing room with her heart racing and her hands cold. The paper in front of her had questions she had studied hundreds of times, but even so, her mind wanted to freeze. She took a deep breath, thought about the little desk in her room, the late nights, the boxes Mrs. Eleanor had sent, the coffee with fresh bagels, and she started answering. She spent 2 weeks unable to rest properly, waiting for the results. When the list came out, she didn't pass. She made the second call list for the program, a good score, one that had improved compared to her previous attempts, but not enough for medicine, which was always the most competitive of all. "Mrs. Eleanor's called as soon as she found out. Brianna." "I know," she said before the woman could finish. "You're not done. You're just not done yet." "Mrs. Eleanor, I'm almost 30 years old. So what? My older sister finished her literature degree at 54. She taught until she was 70. Age isn't a limit, Brianna. It's an excuse. And you're not the type to use excuses. I already know that." Brianna was silent for a moment. Then she said, in a low voice that didn't have the breath to be any louder, "It's just that it hurts, Mrs. Eleanor. It hurts in a way that's hard to explain." "I know, but it hurts differently than stopping. You already know the difference between those two kinds of pain." That line stayed with Brianna. She wrote it down on a piece of paper and taped it to the edge of the mirror in her room. It stayed there for a long time. But what she didn't know yet was that, while she was trying to pull herself back up after that fall, something was happening on the other side of the city that would change the course of everything once again. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Victoria Sterling was having the worst year of her life. The business she had been running for over a decade, a chain of Radiance aesthetic studios that she had built from scratch with total dedication, was crumbling from the inside. A trusted partner, someone she had shared not only work with, but also birthday lunches and end-of-day confidences, had embezzled a significant amount over nearly a year without Victoria noticing. The lawsuit was just beginning, recovering the money was uncertain, and meanwhile the bills weren't waiting. The large apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows was traded for a smaller one, on a lower floor of a simpler building. The car was sold. Her boyfriend of 5 years, whom she planned to marry once things fell into place, left one rainy night with a suitcase and few words, proving he had stayed for the comfort and not for the person. Victoria was turning herself inside out to keep from sinking. And in the middle of all this, Mrs. Eleanor's health began to worsen. Her mother had a heart condition that needed monitoring more frequently than she could manage. Appointments at the city's public health system had wait lists that took weeks, and the private clinics she would have been able to afford a year earlier were now out of reach. It was on a Sunday afternoon, when Victoria got home after an exhausting day of red tape, that she found a note on the living room table in Mrs. Eleanor's small, careful handwriting. It read, "Talk to Brianna. She'll understand." Victoria stared at the paper for a long time. She hadn't forgotten that day. Sometimes she thought about it with a discomfort she couldn't quite name. That laugh had come from a place she preferred not to examine too closely, because when she allowed herself to examine it, she didn't much like what she saw. She saw someone who had assumed the uniform says everything about a person. She saw someone who had forgotten where her own family had come from. She picked up her phone. She stood still. Call for what? To ask for help from a person she had embarrassed in front of her own mop. To say what? But Mrs. Eleanor didn't leave notes without reason. In 72 years of life, she had learned to only say what needed to be said. Victoria dialed. On the other end, Brianna answered after 2 rings, with the neutral voice of someone who wasn't expecting the call. Victoria didn't beat around the bush. She explained her mother's situation, the heart problems, the difficulty of getting an appointment with a specialist in a reasonable amount of time. And then she said, with a restraint that was visible effort even over the phone, "My mother said you would understand. I don't exactly know what that means, but I needed to call." Brianna was silent for a few seconds. She could have hung up. She could have said she didn't know anything, thanked her for the call, and ended it there. That woman had laughed at the most serious thing in her life without even blinking, in front of the yellow gloves and the mop, as if the fact that she was in uniform already answered everything that needed to be answered. But Brianna thought of Mrs. Eleanor, those 5 boxes arriving at her door, those Sunday morning phone calls, that coffee that had lasted almost 2 hours, that phrase about the 2 types of pain that was still taped to her mirror. "I'll see what I can do," she said. It wasn't a big promise. It was the most honest sentence she had at that moment. What Victoria didn't know, because Brianna didn't say it on that phone call, was that she had finally passed her medical school entrance exams 3 weeks earlier. The letter was in the drawer, with her name printed on official paper that she had read about 10 times before believing it. Enrollment would be the following month. And throughout those 3 years, especially in the last few months, Brianna had connected with a group of students who organized themselves to help the community navigate the healthcare system, identifying specialists at affiliated clinics, guiding families on the required paperwork, finding less in-demand appointment times on the waiting lists. It wasn't the work of the doctor she was going to become. It was the beginning of what she wanted to become. She called a friend from her study group, who was in her 3rd year and who knew a cardiologist, who saw patients at a partner clinic in the neighboring neighborhood, on a schedule that was rarely full because few people knew about that path. In less than a week, Mrs. Eleanor had an appointment scheduled. When Victoria found out, she was speechless for a moment. "How did you get it so fast?" Brianna took a moment to answer. "I know people who study medicine." There was a long pause on the line. A long pause, different from the other pauses. "Brianna," Victoria's voice was smaller than she probably wanted it to be. "That day, at my apartment, I was so cruel to you without even realizing how cruel I was. I know there are no words that can undo what I did, but I need to say that." "I know," Brianna said. "Don't you want to let me finish?" "Mrs. Victoria." Brianna took a breath. "You don't need to apologize for laughing. You did me a favor without knowing it." Every time I wanted to stop, when the exhaustion got too heavy, I remembered that laugh, and I thought, I'm going to prove she was wrong about me. A pause. "Your mother is the one who really helped me. She's the one you need to have this conversation with." Victoria was silent for a while. "Does my mother know about all of this?" "From the beginning. There are things you find out about the people closest to you, and you just stand there, not understanding how you never saw it before. A mother who works behind the scenes while her daughter works out in the open. A silence that protects without asking for credit. I imagine Victoria stayed like that for a long time after that phone call, staring at nothing. On the day of the appointment, Brianna went along. It wasn't required, but she wanted to. She stayed in the waiting room while the doctor saw Mrs. Eleanor reading a human physiology textbook she carried everywhere since she had passed the entrance exam. The pages were marked, underlined, with notes in the margins in small, careful handwriting. When Mrs. Eleanor came out of the examination room, she saw Brianna sitting there and stopped. She looked at her for a moment, not with surprise, with something that was different from surprise. It was recognition, the kind that happens when life confirms what you already knew, but were afraid to believe. "You passed," Mrs. Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Brianna looked up from the book and smiled the way she rarely smiled, from the inside out. "I passed." Mrs. Eleanor walked over to her with the careful steps of someone who respects her own body, and sat in the chair beside her. She was silent for a while, hands folded in her lap, looking down the hallway ahead. "You know what I thought when I first saw you in that apartment," she said. "I thought, this young woman has something in her eyes that can't be bought, and that can't be extinguished. You can throw rain at it. You can throw people laughing at it. You can throw debt and a boyfriend who doesn't believe in you and sleepless nights at it. It doesn't go out." Brianna felt her throat tighten. "You bet on me before you really knew me." "I knew you in that moment. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to learn how to read people, Brianna. I had plenty of time to learn, and not to waste what I learned." Justin had left Brianna's life in the 2nd year after that morning at the apartment. It wasn't dramatic or scandalous. It was an accumulation of silences that kept growing until one ordinary night he said he couldn't imagine a future next to someone who lived somewhere else inside her own head. She understood what he meant. It hurt a lot. It hurt in that way that squeezes your chest without asking permission. But she understood. After he left, she cried about 3 nights in a row, and then opened her biochemistry workbook. Because that's what she knew how to do in hard times. It's what she had always done. Martha's health had gone through a more complicated phase in the middle of her 2nd year, but with the more regular follow-up that Brianna was able to arrange through the connections she kept building, things stabilized. Martha had a habit of smiling every time her daughter walked into the house with a new book under her arm, as if each book were a victory she felt as her own too. The month after Mrs. Eleanor's appointment, Brianna enrolled. She walked into a big room full of new students, most of whom had finished high school just a few years earlier, sat down at one of the desks in the middle, and placed her physiology book on the table like she always did. The professor walked in, opened the roster, and when he called her name, she answered with a voice that came out firmer than she expected. Here. It was a small word, but it was one of the biggest she had ever spoken in her entire life. Victoria showed up every now and then after that, not as a boss, not as a close friend, but as someone who had crossed the same space of the same story from very different angles and who had come out the other side changed too. The two of them sometimes met up with Mrs. Eleanor at a bakery cafe the lady liked downtown. They talked about small things and big things, about how people reveal who they are in the moments they think no one is watching, about how life never stops teaching those who are willing to keep learning. Victoria was rebuilding her business, smaller now, with a different partner, more cautious. She had learned that size isn't what sustains a company. Character is. And Mrs. Eleanor, at 72, with her heart closely monitored, went to her regular appointments, lived well, and every now and then picked up the phone and sent a short message to Brianna. The message was always the same. "How's the future doctor doing?" And Brianna always answered the same way, with that smile a person can read even without seeing. "Getting there, Mrs. Eleanor. Getting there." End of story. What a story, folks. What a story. I keep thinking about how many Briannas are out there waking up at 5 in the morning, catching 2 buses, studying into the wee hours, carrying a dream that the world insists on finding too heavy to bear. And how many Mrs. Eleanors exist too, people who have lived long enough to recognize the worth of what others dismiss with a laugh. If you know someone like that, from either side of this story, tell us in the comments. And if this story left something with you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. Your company here means a lot to whoever is on the other side of the screen.